everyone, and I welcome you on behalf of the Australian National Centre for Latin American Studies. This is the first public lecture we have this year, and I'm the new director of UNCLAS. I'm Dr. Elizabeth Meyer from the School of Languages, Literature and Linguistics. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians, elders past and present, on whose land we meet today and whose cultures are among the oldest on the planet. And today we will learn a lot about old cultures, very, very old cultures. So I have the pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Christopher Carter, who is an accomplished archaeologist with a PhD from ANU, from the School of Archaeology and Anthropology. And this is a school with very, very strong and long-standing connections to Peru and to Chile, specifically to the Catholic University and to the Cusco School. Dr. Carter's expertise is multifarious, including commercial exploits and advising on heritage issue in major mining and infrastructure developments. His archaeological research interests lie firmly in Latin America, and more specifically in the Atacama Desert spanning southern Peru and right into northern Chile. So his talk tonight will take us through mortuary and burial practices of the mummies found in that specific region to commercial practices of mummy trading. So please welcome Dr. Chris Carter.
What I'm going to do tonight, did anyone see me speak a few years ago on Northern Chile? One. That's all right then. Okay, I'm not going to be repeating myself. The first section is a relatively quick and brief introduction to the area, both culturally and geographically. And then I'm going to tell you a story about some mummies. So we need to introduce that before we get onto that story. So we'll start with a very brief introduction to this area. Now, Arica is the northernmost city in Chile. It was once part of Peru. It's literally only 15 kilometres from the border today. It's a political location, but you can see that it's also in a geographic location there where there's a bend in the coastline. And that's significant. Not significant for where Arica is, but it's significant for the people who once lived there and those who still live there commercially, because this section is part of the driest desert in the world. It's an area that doesn't have droughts, because if you don't get rain at all, it's a bit hard to have a drought. So there's some areas there that have an annual average rainfall of nil. Arica, I believe, has an average rainfall of something like 0.1 of a millimetre, perhaps 0.2 of a millimetre. And the only reason you have an average like that is that once every 10 years you might get a millimetre of rain. I've seen it rain there once, and I've been visiting there regularly for 20 odd years. But the reason that the weather is so dry is because you have the rain shadow, the rain-bearing weather comes in from the east, and you've got this massive mountain range in the road. So the Andes block the convection currents coming in that way, and you've also got the Humboldt current flowing from the south in the Antarctic region, flowing right up the coast, and that, of course, reduces evaporation and actually results in the dry weather. It's not quite that simple, but that's why you have a desert there. But it's also one of the richest marine biomasses in the world, and that's one reason why people were able to settle there. This is just a schematic diagram of what the coastline looks like, and it does look dramatic. This feature on the right-hand side is very much like a volcano. It's because it is. And so we have a very young mountain range. The Andes are still growing. And we have from 6,000 metres on the far right to the coastline, but the coastline comes up abruptly from sea level, obviously, to 700, 800, 900 metres, sheer cliffs. So you don't have a coastal plain, you have a coastal range. The coastal range then falls down slightly to around an average altitude of 1,500 to perhaps 2,500 metres in the Pampa. And this is the region here that I'm talking about. This is the Pampa, and this is the Pre-Cordillera into the Cordillera. So it rises up to 6,000 metres. And you'll see these large ravines, these large canyons. The Q stands for Quebrada, the Quebrada de Chaco, the Camarones de Vitor, and so forth. These are massive river valleys, I suppose you could say. Some of them have water, some of them regularly have water, and some of them flood annually. But these river valleys were not caused by water erosion, they were caused by pyroclastic flows. which are massive, major volcanic events. And so what we're talking about is not lava flowing down, but mud and gas eruptions, and they're flowing down at anything to 500-600 kilometres an hour, and they just carve through solid rock. That's what's caused these features, and they are very, very dramatic. This is the sort of environment we're looking at. I'm going to move from the mountains to the coast to just give you a very, very brief overview of what it is. So we have volcanoes, but you can see here, this is taken from about 4,500 metres. That volcano is approaching 6,000 metres, and yet we have virtually no snow. So even at that altitude, you get very little snow. Permanent snow, that's about it. You get a bit more snow in winter. If you go down to southern Patagonia, the permanent snow line's at 1,500 metres. So that's a huge difference in the climatic conditions. As you move away, this is into the Pre-Cordillera, you see the permanent snow line there. It's very, very dry, but this area does get rain. Sometimes gets heavy rain in what they call the Bolivian summer. And then once you get down into the Pampa, you get beyond the reach of rain, and it's very, very dry, dramatic landscapes. And this is one of the canyons, the Quebrada de Chaca, that actually passes through the Pampa. Dry, hyper-arid on the Pampa itself, but you can see there's vegetation in the river because we have subterranean water. And this is the sort of thing I'm talking about. The rivers sometimes flow, but sometimes not flowing from start to finish. They disappear, they go underground. And that's what you can see here on the far right. The river's underground. On the left, where the vegetation is, the river's actually a lot higher. That's to do with the bedrock and so forth. And you can see here's a little bit of vegetation. You get an idea of how dry it is out onto the Pampa. And this is actually a series of geoglyphs that are formed on the Pampa. You've probably heard about the geoglyphs from Nazca in southern Peru. Well, there's a large number of geoglyphs through this particular area in northern Chile, and they date from generally the Tiwanaku period, from perhaps 600 to 1200 AD, 600 to 1200 AD. And this is actually a photograph taken from the coastal range, or the back of the coastal range, looking east toward the mountain range. And in that haze in the distance is the mountain. Sometimes you can see them, sometimes you can't, but it's about anywhere between 100 and 200 kilometres wide. And then this is what I found surprising when I first went to this area, is the desert continues all the way to the sea. We talk about deserts in Australia. We do not have any deserts that compare to this, because we have droughts, we have arid environments, but we don't have hyper-arid environments. And you have an environment here where the rain never falls, and so therefore no vegetation at all. And then this is the city of Arica itself. And you can see here, that this is a desertous landscape, but a highly productive river system. There's a lot of water comes through from the mountains, from the rainstorms and subterranean aquifers that bring water through, and so the market gardens are very productive in this area. And this is actually the beginning or the end of the coastal range. From this point northwards, and as I said, you're only 10 or 15 kilometres from Peru, you have a coastal plain. Once we start at El Morro in Arica, you're in the coastal range, and so the cliffs that actually fall into the sea are anything up to 800 metres tall. And so just briefly, I'll give you an overview of settlement. You mightn't find too much literature that actually talks about the time depth for the first peoples to arrive in Chile, because it's only happened in the last 5-6 years. But we now have dates, verifiable dates, from 13,000 years BP. For those who are not sure of that, that means before present. Just replace that with ago. But this what it's calibrated BP, so this is a radiocarbon date that is reasonably accurate. So we're talking about 13,000 years ago, people were living in this environment. And we go through these periods, well, the archaic, we love dividing things up and giving things fancy names. So very little changed between this time. So you're talking 13,000 years to 4,000 years. So over 9,000 years, not a great deal of cultural change. Then we get to what we call the formative period, and it's formative in as much as technology changes, and so it's dramatic change of culture. So it's during this late archaic and into the formative, we start to see ceramics appear. We start to see more elaborate textiles. The textiles here are really just woven grasses and reeds and so forth. A little bit of cotton, but cotton was mainly used for fishing lines. Once we start to get formative, you start to see settlements appear, tombs appear, things changing. This is the most interesting, I suppose, very complex, because we see these political units starting to develop in the mountains, not on the coast, but we talk about the Tiwanaku expansion. Tiwanaku in Bolivia today, near Lake Titicaca, is about 600 kilometres in a straight line, and that was impacted during this, what we call the middle horizon. And then the late intermediate, which was the fall off of the Tiwanaku cultural or political impositions. And then right at the very end, that what we call the late period, it's when we see the arrival of the Inca, but not Inca domination. We find Inca ceramics, Inca textiles, but there's no architecture or anything like that. So it appears that the Inca had some impact, but they didn't dominate, because obviously these people paid their taxes and contributed, so the Inca didn't have to be there in number. So we don't have any Inca people, but Inca influence. But what I want to talk about is the change that goes through from here right through to the end in their mortuary practices, because in the beginning, that's where all the cultural evidence we have is in the burial practices. So the very first people that lived there and developed into what we call the Chinchorro people, and this was named after a beach in Arica, where the first Chinchorro remains were found. So that's where the name comes from. Their toolkit consisted of fishing lines made of cotton. Their sinkers are not lead, these are basalt, ground basalt. They had bags where they collected shellfish, harpoons for spearing large terrestrial marine mammals like sea lions. This is known as a chope. It's a rib of a sea lion, and it's used for prying abalone off the rocks. And this is the sort of material we would find. And this is what we call the Chinchorro range, Ilo in southern Peru, and then all the way down to Antofagasta, with a bit of a gap, because we don't have a lot of evidence from this area at all. But Arica and Camarones is the heartland, or the oldest form of the Chinchorro. And the cultural marker for the Chinchorro are their mummies. Now, these are the oldest artificial mummies in the world. And I'm talking human remains that just haven't been set out in the sun to dry. They've actually taken steps to preserve them in one form or another. And we'll get to actually how they did that, but these are far older, many thousands of years older than the Egyptians. But they didn't build houses. They perhaps had boats. They had a bit of fishing gear. Their art was very limited, and they lived a very simple, perhaps an egalitarian society. So their mummies were where most of their cultural energy was expended. And it's a lot different than the Egyptians in more ways than one, and it's because what we have is the oldest mummies are found about 7,000 years ago, and these are called the black mummies. Prior to that, as I said, we had people arrive 13,000 years ago. The oldest human remains we have are just in excess of 8, and they weren't mummified as such like this, but they were starting to tend to their dead and treat them with some care and reverence and bury them with some grave goods. When we get to the black mummies, there's a great deal of change. And as I said, I'll give you the details directly, but the title black mummies is hardly original. They are coated in a manganese paste, which is black. They're not all in as good a condition as that. Those there with face masks, these are actually 2 museum exhibits, and these are some of the now exhibited in the museum, but as they were found, and they've lost most of their outer casing, mainly because they're so fragile. But you can see a lot of work's been gone into these internally to actually mummify the remains. And you can see here that some of them are painted, and you can actually see here that these are all moulded in mud, and there's genitalia formed and so forth. There are a few variations on a theme. This one here is actually wrapped in a feather cape, and it's not just loose feathers sewn on, it's actually bird skin, in this case pelican skin. So the bird has been skun with the feathers intact, and then they've wrapped the mummy. And this is one we located in the centre, in the city of Arica, underneath a hotel. When they wanted to build a swimming pool, we found 14 mummies where they dug the hole to build their swimming pool. And what we didn't realise was we moved this stone. The stone might have been holding the head up because the head might have been wanting to fall to one side or something. And when we moved the stone, we realised that they had laid a coating of feathers and skin. You can see here that the stone is covered with skin, and it went over the face and then over this stone. So it's another one that we see with the bird skin. About 5,000 years ago, you moved from the black to the red. So they have iron oxide in the paste. This is not all the mummies, the majority of them. And so we see a gradual transition from the black to the red in different areas, and there's also a difference in the way that they are actually put together. So we can actually look at a change in culture. For some reason or another, they've gone from this period, and then right at the end, with the majority of the mummies we find are just plain, simple mud mummies. And this is around 5,000 years ago, they were doing this, along with the red mummies, and then around 3.5-7 years ago, ceased to exist. The Chinchorro culture disappeared, and the way we've judged that is because they bury their dead completely differently. And we'll get to that in a short while. This is a site in the town, in the city, in the old historic part of the city. A local builder was going to build a guest house and found the remains or human remains, actually just down here. He dug a hole. He wanted to see how deep his foundations would have to be. Started digging up mummies. And so and I won't go into how, but it was a very good heritage management practice. The university now own this property, and this is actually the site of the Chinchorro Museum in Arica, and these mummies are still there in the ground. And if you ever visit, you must see this museum because it's got a glass floor over it, and you can actually walk over these mummies as we excavated them. So you can see here, this was well before they built the museum. So, and these are the mud-coated mummies. But you can see here, these mummies, these burials are elongated. They're extended. That's the main indicator for Chinchorro. And sometimes they were buried in family lots. You can see adults and children. And interestingly, the Chinchorro and some of the oldest mummies found are actually fetal. So these are preterm, perhaps stillbirths, and then a lot of neonatal. So young, perhaps died within their first year. They mummified them as well as the adults. And in some cases, we've actually found evidence where perhaps the mother died in childbirth, and we found them together, buried together. Grave goods are generally restricted to just the odd piece. Here we have a stone knife, still clasped in the hand of a juvenile. This is a very tiny hand, and it's not a very good shot, but that's a wicker basket which would have been used for collecting shellfish. This gives you some idea of the preservation in the dry environment. You can actually still see the fingerprints. I've excavated mummies here that are 4,000 and 5,000 years old, and they still smell, and they still have fat content, which is quite unusual, but that's how dry it is. And so just basically a quick overview. The founder population naturally mummified, just sun-dried, but extended. Then they started to build the complex black mummies, the less complex red, and then the natural again to finish with, coated with mud. And this is how they did it. And when I say there's a lot of work gone in, because they would get the deceased and would take their legs and arms and head off. So they were deconstructed. They realised early on that the major problem with preserving a body was to get rid of the water. Most of the water is in organs, so all of the internal organs would have been removed, and the brain. The brain is primarily water, and so that needs to be dispensed with, and then even possibly get rid of the muscle, because muscle breaks down very, very quickly. So if you can remove all the material that contains water, you actually dehydrate them very, very quickly, and they preserve well. So that's what they did. And so they would replace the organs. Here's a cross-section through, and it would be just grasses, hair, mud, anything they could find, ash, just to give them the bulk. And then they would use timber. These dark lines here are timbers, and then bind them to the legs and arms to hold them in place, and then they would completely coat the entire body in mud to give them form. And sometimes skin was replaced, skin of an animal or human skin. And that skin that's been, like people or deceased that have been floating around in the water, sometimes their skin is sort of toughened in salt water particularly. So in some cases they actually replace their own skin. So these people might have drowned, something like that. Their neck, their head was reassembled. They actually disarticulated the cranium. I don't know if you realise, but the sutures that hold the babies are loosely held together. With the adult, they crack them open to remove the brain and then bind the head back up and then attach it to the body. Now that's the black mummy. The red mummy, whilst it was different colour, it was simplified. Instead of removing the limbs and the head, they actually left them intact, and they just made incisions in the body, removed the organs through these incisions, and then actually removed the muscle where they could. And then they would get a single piece of timber, make an incision in the leg, and then drive that timber up through the pelvic girdle, right up until it protruded into the head area. So they didn't have to pull them apart. So they simplified them. That's the big difference between the Egyptian mummies and these mummies. The Egyptian mummies started simple and became more complex. In the end, the Egyptian mummies were so complex that they actually didn't preserve them. They started to rot. Whereas this here, they went from the complex to the simple. And we're not really sure why, but it could have been an increase in population. So more deaths, more involved, more time needed to actually prepare them. So this is the major impact culturally here was the change from an extended burial to non-extended. And we're talking about the formative period. So you can see these barriers, you can see these horizons in the cultural layout very, very clearly. And what I'm using here is some material that I actually traced in the American Museum of Natural History in New York. And these are formative burials that come from Pisagua, which is a couple of quebradas south of Arica, still in the same geographic zone. And there's, you can see them on the side of the hill. And this is a fellow here by the name of Junius Bird, who was one of the early archaeologists. A lot of people believe that that's who Indiana Jones was modelled on. And having a look at his young female assistant, you can perhaps see why. But that's Greta Mosny, and she became a very well-known South American archaeologist and did some fantastic work even after Junius went back to New York to actually be the director of the American Museum of Natural History. And these are some of his notes. But if you have a look, there's no mummies visible here, but each stick, there's a marker, a grave marker here, and a basket which the bodies were placed in. But you can see here, that's a good one there, you can see how they're what we call flexed, the fetal position. The knees are up to the chest, and some of them are semi-flexed, but the majority are fully flexed, but they're laying on their side, and they're placed in these baskets with simple grave goods. And the other feature that you quite often see in this period are the construction of what we call tumulus. These are mound constructions. So this is the natural landscape here. It's flat. So this hill, the entire hill, is artificial. And actually someone's dug a hole here, and I actually continued on. I used this damaged part here to do an excavation. But it's layers of grass and sand and grass and sand and so forth to build up this mound, and there are lots of burials actually interspersed within the mound. I haven't looked for burials there. In my excavation here, I was not looking for human remains. The problem is there are thousands of them there, and so it was very, very hard to actually steer clear of them. But where other people are coming and looking for treasures, they turn up and you find human remains quite regularly. What we found in this area, you can see these pink flags. This is on the flat below the tumuli, and every pink flag is a little timber post. We wondered whether it was a corral, had something to do with a building or what have you, so we selected a post and to see what was below it, but what we found were these burials. So this gentleman here was sitting. He was flexed. He certainly wasn't extended, so it was well beyond the Chinchorro period. And there's the grave marker here, and there's another post, but also lots of reed actually covering this burial. This may well have grown and become a mound later, but not at that particular time. So we're talking at about 3,000 years old, this burial. Still a little bit of hair existing on the cranium. But also this is a sea lion rib, and I showed you earlier that it had a wrapped cane handle. That's the chilpe that was used to actually, as the divers would use to gather shellfish. So it gives you some indication of perhaps what this fellow would have been doing in life, and he was likely to be a diver. And shellfish were a major component of their economy, so it's not surprising. We selected, I didn't select, I asked a volunteer to select that post, and I said, well, pick another one to see if it's also a burial. And he picked another one at random, and was only an inch below the surface, and we found this smaller body here. It's damaged, badly damaged, because it was so close to the surface, actually cars had been driving over it. Gets a lot of visitation by fishermen and so forth on the weekend, so cars were going over it, and that's what's crushed it. But you can see here, there's the knee, so the knee's flexed right up to the chest. There's the other one, you can see them, they're all compressed, compacted. You can just see here there's some woven reed matting, which is common for Chinchorro, but certainly not the flexed. And what we found was interesting is the skull, the cranium, was filled with ash. So I think this is a major burial. It's a transitional period between the Chinchorro and the Formative, whereas they ceased to bury them extended, were flexing it, but they still were removing the brain. The actual body cavity had not been modified at all, but just the skull. And not only that, it had like a bobtail, we call them. They're like a ponytail, but sticks out the front, and also shell beads around the neck. During the late Formative, this is where we see major cemeteries appearing along the coast. All of that white material you can see littering the slope is human remains. They're just coming down the slope from other burials. But you can see these are seated and wrapped in a cotton and alpaca or llama wool manta rather. So this is the sort of thing you will find. This is not one that I found. This is actually in the museum, but you can see here it's the material itself isn't overly complex design-wise, but it is actually trimmed with some lovely pattern wear. And this is, as I said, ranges from alpaca through to cotton. And also we start to see a lot more grave goods, and these are spear points and harpoons and so forth. This is a site just to the north of Arica where I was working in 2000, I think this was. We were asked to survey this area, and of course we found human remains. But what we found here, which was a move on again culturally, is that these were in elaborate tombs. You can see here they've used river cobbles, which was only 50 metres away, they get the cobbles, and they dug quite a large hole. It's about 1.6, 1.7 metres deep, paved the floor, and then made a tomb which was about 1.5 metres in diameter, and then narrowed down the top, so it was bell-shaped. And then they would cover the top with reed. The mummy that was in this one was exposed, and it certainly wasn't preserved very well. In fact, we know this mummy was squatting because he's actually, when we lifted the pelvic girdle up, his feet were still intact in the ground, but his head had been removed, and the majority of the textiles had been removed. So this is a looted tomb. You can see here there's a belt. This is a woven belt that was actually around the girdle. And we also found elaborately plaited hair. And in fact, these are hair extensions. So you can see some of this hair would have been that of the deceased, but some of it was extended. So this might have been the deceased, and this was a hair extension, which is quite common for that period. We see evidence of that in a number of areas. And then we had no idea where the head was. And then in a shallow pit just next to the tomb, we actually found this cranium. And interestingly, we also found the mandible the lower jaw in the tomb, and that lower jaw and they fitted perfectly, and actually the wear of the teeth fitted perfectly. So we know this cranium belonged to, at least to the mandible that was in the tomb. What's interesting here, it's actually a deformed cranial deformation here, artificially deformed. So they took steps to change the shape of the skull. Very, very common in this area, more so as you travel up to Nazca and places like that. Very, very major deformation practices performed there. And this is the foot that was in the sandal, which was present, like the body was squatting in the bottom of the tomb. I didn't take a lot of notice, it was just a foot. But then when I looked at the photo, and I've since gone back and had a look at this toenail. This toenail here is pedicured, it's actually been worked, so this person was not a worker, because if you look at the locals' feet when they were out in the garden, they don't look like that. So this person was, it was of some position. It might have been a shaman, or may well have been a leader of the group, but he definitely wasn't working out in the fields for the year or so before he died, because it's a perfectly pedicured large toenail. The grave goods there were a little bit more elaborate. This is what we start to see. We move on from the formative period, and you start to see elaborate textiles, weavings, and these are actually filled with food. These were filled with corn. The problem is rodents, mice and so forth, they were chewing holes, and bugs also getting in and eating the corn. So we found the corn cobs, but not too much corn itself. We actually found intact corn cobs below that, where the rodents hadn't got to, but those in the bags were virtually emptied. And this is some of the other textiles we found in other graves around this period. This is about 1000 to 1200 AD, these periods date from. And this is an interesting one here. This is actually made from the reed, typha, a reed that is found today in the local creek, because one of the volunteers that was working with us was experienced weaver, basket weaver, and so she went and collected the reeds, and in 20 minutes had actually replicated this little bag. It was purely an adornment. It was a useless bag. You couldn't put anything in it, but it certainly was accompanying the deceased there. Now, you may have seen photographs and what have you of elaborate Inca mummies. We don't find that in this area here. The Inca, their presence is marginal at best, but what we've got is hundreds of burials from the Inca period. We're not saying that there are Inca who are buried there, but what you can see here, that's the remains of a mummy that we've wrapped up, because looters kept on moving it. We covered it up and it'd be uncovered. But you can see here, there's a hole here. These are little cyst graves, very simple. There's another one there, there's another one there, another one there. And this is a bunker built by the Navy, but just dozens of burials all the way through this area. And every time there's a tremor, they dislodge more burials. So there's just any amount of them there. And this is what you find, simply wrapped, perhaps one or two layers of material. The outer layer fairly neutral, and then some more elaborate as you get inside. And this is the remains of a tomb that had been looted. So I don't know what the looters were after, but what they left behind is some really nice decorated materials. This is typically Inca. Interestingly, 3 skull caps from juveniles. These are not small children, but they're sub-adult. But they're just the skull cap, just the colour. So we don't know what that's there. These are elaborate hats, and some actually timber there that would have been parts of harpoons. So, there's a lot more material and textiles in these burials towards the end. So that's the first part of the story. And I'm very, very quickly going to move on to the second part, because what the Atacama Desert did was preserve the dead from way back in the distant past to the more recent past. The deceased are intact. The grave goods are intact in many cases. And so what we have is from the late 18th century, more so in the 19th century, into the 20th century, these burials that were found in the Atacama Desert became a resource, because this was the period where the antiquarians were running amok and collecting worldwide. This is the sort of thing people were coming back for. And there was a real desire to see the other, to understand what was going on in other parts of the world. So people who couldn't travel were flocking to exhibitions in museums or anything like that. This is rich and poor. They wanted to know what was going on the other side of the world. I threw this one in because, well, this is a mummified parrot that was collected in the 19th century, but I just like this one here. This is a very early selfie. And here's the mummy, and there's the string for that. Didn't have time-lapse camera, and this was early 20th century, but I think it's a really good shot. I should show that to my daughter. She's besotted by selfies. And then you have the glamorous Greta Mosti sitting next to a dried-up old mummy. But we're going to come all the way back to Australia. And the Maclean Museum, has anybody been to the Maclean Museum in Sydney? If you get up to Sydney, go to the university, find the geology department, go to the Maclean Museum. It's a terrific little museum. It's very much like an old Victorian period museum. It was set up by two Williams, and mainly New Guinea and a few other areas, botanical, the birds of paradise, and all sorts of different things. Typical collector's period, dating from a large insect collection that was brought over in the mid part of the 19th century. What they have in their collection is a Peruvian mummy. I first come across this some years ago when I was doing I was involved with an exhibition on death that was put on by the Australian Museum. So I don't know if anybody went to that. This Peruvian mummy was actually on display there. So I knew they had a Peruvian mummy. It was the same as many that I'd seen, so I wasn't that interested. But some years later, a colleague of mine from Chile came over to visit, and I said, look, we'll go and have a look at this mummy and so forth. And while we were there, they handed us the paperwork that was associated with it. It was fairly meagre, and so what we were able to establish was an adult female. That wasn't interesting. Was originally wrapped in textile, but there was no textiles, Sydney University did a radiocarbon date, so we're looking at 1200 BP, so at the height of what we call the Tiwanaku period. Her major organs were intact, but she'd undergone cranial deformation, but that was it, no records. So we had a bit of an examination. If you have a look here, you can see the impression on her arm where the textiles actually had left impressions on her arm. And you can see this damage here. This is likely to have occurred when the textiles were removed, because if there was any moisture there, they would have adhered in the early days and actually were ripped. She was ripped when she was open. Her feet were deformed, and the distal phalanges, the last bone on the phalanges, the toes, were missing, and we reckon they were bound up tight. And so when they were pulled, when the binding was taken off, she was damaged. This is a shot you can see here. The forehead is a lot flatter than your own. Feel your own, you can see the difference. But also when we looked into an X-ray material, you can see here the thickening here. Thickening there and there, which means the head was bound. That's how the deformation process is. It's a binding the head from an early age, but continuing right on to adulthood. But where did she come from? She come from Peru. We had a toe tag, that's all we had. But the museum gave me some records, and these records suggested that she'd come from Chacarita. And then the penny dropped, because Arica was part of Peru up until the 1890s in the War of the Pacific. Now this made my hair stand on end, because I don't know if you noticed, but where I excavated that tomb in 2000 was Chacarita. Not quite the spelling there, but it's just north of Arica. It's just the last settlement this side of the border. It's a suburb of Arica. And we start to find these records that talk about mummies coming to Australia. And this fellow by the name of Jorge Dunham arrived in 1851, and the inventory and the cargo manifest said one case of specimens. And then during that period, there's lots of advertisements in the newspaper. They're exhibiting a mother and a child, apart from lots of pottery and all sorts of miscellanea. And they were charging sixpence to visit, and it was so popular that they had another exhibition the following week, put the price up to $1. They had experts talking, an expert on phrenology, which is the bumps on the heads, came in from the museum and said that these people were primitive and probably criminals and so forth. And in December, when the interest had dropped off, which was about a month, but in about a month no one was bothering to come anymore, Dunham wrote to the museum and he said, look, I want £200, but you can have these mummies. These are the most spectacular things ever to arrive in Australia. The museum said, well, we don't have £200. That's a lot of money in 1851. So what the museum suggested is that we'll put them on display and we'll collect monies. And if we get the £200, you can have it. And he agreed. But in a month, they'd only raised £35, which is considerable. You know, really, in a month, they'd raised that much. He was desperate. We don't know what's going on here. There needs to be more research done. But he dropped his price to £85. And he actually starts, I won't read this, but he talks about the laws of Peru preventing him getting the mummies, and he had to sneak around in the dark to get them, etc., etc. That's why why I risked my life. I could have gone to jail and so forth and so on. And so that's why that high price is vindicated. But what happened? The museum didn't part with any money, but we find newspaper advertisement in 1852 that old George had actually pawned the mummies. And he didn't repay the debt, and so the pawnbroker came along and took them from the museum. And that's the last record we have of them. We don't know if the mummy at the Macleay Museum is the one and the same, but there's only one. Because the mummy at the Macleay Museum was not recorded. They had a major fire and a lot of their records were burnt in the late 19th century. It was the 1960s that someone found this mummy in the cupboard. And so that's why they don't have any provenance. They don't know where this mummy's come from. The way George talked and the way they advertise it, we doubt very much if it's another one, but we know that there are thousands of mummies in Arica, so it could have been. So we're not 100%, but we're pretty sure. So I started to backtrack and I wanted to find out about Jorge Dunham. George Bleaky, bit of an odd name. He was born in either Newfoundland or Ireland. We're not 100% sure. But we do know that in the 1840s he was sailing backwards and forwards from Britain to Australia on the Dalian. Interestingly, he arrived in 1842. The day after he arrived, he married Jemima Ham, who was a passenger. Just so happened that her dad was the first Baptist minister in Melbourne. And I don't know what happened during the trip, but the day after they arrived, he married her. And she had a child shortly thereafter, so that gives you some idea of what happened. But in 1844, he returned. So he was in Australia, and I believe the Dublin went across to Norfolk Island and did a few trips around the place in that 12 months, and then returned to Britain. In 1848, Dunham returned to Australia, no longer a captain. They offloaded Jemima at Cape Town in a coffin. The son survived. This was another son, not the first one. He died shortly after they arrived in Sydney. And then a second son was left with the Ham family. He was the first Baptist minister in Melbourne, but he'd moved up to Sydney. And they became quite a prominent family, the Hams. But I haven't gone down that path. But interestingly enough, in 1851, we find a record of Mr. George Dunham sailing to Arica in Peru. He was not captain of the vessel. The vessel was chartered by fellows by the name of Elder, Goldsborough and Mort. You might have heard of them. And in 1851, they were trying to break the monopoly that Peru had on the alpaca market. He'd actually somehow ingratiated himself into this project and said, I know Arica, I know where I can get alpaca, let me go. So off he went. And we start to wonder why Arica, and I started to wonder, well, he knew the area, had he been there before? And so what I found in 1839, this vessel arrived in Liverpool from the Americas with Dunham in command, and the cargo included 2 mummies. So he obviously had been there before. And we have this is a record from the journal, the Proceedings of the Royal Irish Academy. They were advertising a mummy unwrapping. And I'll get you to read that because I think it's very important here. A gentleman travelling to South America on a regular basis. I have found records of other visits backwards and forwards across the Atlantic, around the Cape, mind you. So he must have been a fair sailor. Visiting a colony of Irish. Captain Dunham's father was the harbour master at Dublin, Dunleary, and he was visiting and was hospitably received, and they took him for a day's pleasure to a wild spot to dig mummies. It's hardly, risking his life and digging mummies up in the dark so he wouldn't be arrested. It was a bit of fun. But, I think this description, we can take you to exactly where this was going on. While you're finishing that, I'll just quickly go back to George's attempt to import alpaca. The Peruvians were more strict about importing or exporting alpaca than they were mummies. And there's no way in the world George was going to get his hands on any alpaca. But the British consul heard about him, and he knew of an Englishman living in Tacna, which is just north of Arica in Peru, still in Peru, who was building up a herd of alpaca, and he became the first person to bring alpaca to Australia in 1854. His name is Charles Ledger. He's buried in Brookwood Cemetery, and he brought out a big mob of alpaca in 1854, and they were grazed in Centennial Park, but I think most of them died because they just didn't like the low altitude. So it was a failed attempt, and Charles Ledger died in poverty, and there was a pauper's grave at Brookwood Cemetery. It's another story altogether. What happened to George Dunham? We lose track of him in Australia. Doesn't seem to appear. We know he came back in 51 with his mummies, but he was working as a migration agent in Peru. Now, we're all aware of the blackbirding that went on in Australia, in the sugarcane fields. The same thing was happening in Peru. They were recruiting Polynesians to work in the cane fields and in the mines. The captain that Dunham worked for, he was just kidnapping them. He would lure them on board and sail away before they could change their minds. George Dunham refused to cooperate, and they left him marooned on a rock in the Marquesas. But he was rescued. The locals thought this guy's trying to do the right thing. They went and got him off the rock after the captain had sailed off, and he managed to get back to Lima before the boat did, because the captain wasn't going to come back to Lima with no recruits, so he went off looking for more. And anyway, he reported him. As soon as the captain arrived, he was arrested, ended up going to court, and then received a jail term. Interestingly enough, in the court records, his wife gave character evidence about George. So therefore, he had a Peruvian wife at that time. I've looked at the death records, I've gone through all the cemeteries in Lima and so forth, have found no record of George, but there are a lot of Dunhams, well, quite a few Dunhams in the Peruvian phone book, in the Lima phone book. So I think he left his mark, because it's not a very common name. There's quite a few here in Australia. So what did I do about that? I started looking for other evidence. I've only got a few minutes to go. So I went to the Royal Irish Academy. This was a few years ago. I visit Ireland fairly regularly. And, they said, look, our policy changed about 100 years ago. We don't want exhibits. So we had a collection of material of all sorts of different things, and we disposed of them. And the mummies we donated to the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland. So I trekked off down the road to the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, and they said, we don't have those collections anymore. We needed space, etc., etc. So I think it might have been the 1990s, they had an Egyptian mummy and a Peruvian mummy in their collection. And they wrote to the National Museum of Ireland and said, we got these 2 mummies, would you like them? And they said, no, that's all right, we'll throw them away. Literally, they were going to load them up with all the other rubbish they had in their basement and throw them in the tip. So I rang the National Museum of Ireland and I explained the situation, and they said, what would we be doing with a Peruvian mummy? I said, I don't know. That's all I've heard. An hour later, they rang me back and they said, we found it. The reason they didn't want it was that it was Peruvian, so it had nothing to do with Ireland, and it wasn't found by an Irish archaeologist or anything like that. So they really it didn't fall within their collection policies. But they saw fit to take the mummies off their hands because they couldn't see them going to the tip. So they were just put into storage somewhere. And so they called me back. They could have just ignored me, but they didn't. They found the mummy and they called me back and brought them over, and that's what we found. It's very, very similar to what we've got in the McLean Museum. You can see here, this is not wrapped in textile. That's the impression of the textiles. So I believe that this mummy here and the mummy in Sydney underwent the same process, that there would have been a ceremony that people, privileged few, would have been able to witness. They talk about the grisly remains because it's really dark and it doesn't look very pleasant, still smells. But interestingly, you can't quite see there, but you see the elaborate plaiting? It's very, very elaborate plaiting of the hair, similar to the mummy that the remains that we found in Chakayuta. So this probably falls within the same period. And this is the one we're negotiating with because they don't want it. Do we give it back? Who do we give it back to? Do we give it back to Peru or do we give it back to Chile? Because Arica was once Peru, but is now in Chile. So if we give it back to the place where it came from, it's Chile. But it was taken from Peru illegally, and it was in breach of a Peruvian law. So I'm not going to be involved. I'll leave that up to the diplomats. But the search continues because I've started to get very interested and have a look what's around the place. British Museum, 1832, Chinchorro mummy, a baby. The Peabody Museum in Harvard, in 1836, these mummies were collected. These are from Arica. These are not from all over the place. These are Arica deposits. Interestingly, see the red hair? That's not natural. I think it must be something coming out of the soil because you can see the red on the body itself. And that's also in the Peabody Museum in Harvard, in the same collection. But there was Swedes. There's Chinchorro mummies been found in Göteborg in Sweden. They didn't know they had them. They only found them a few years ago. But they were collected by a fellow by the name of Skotsberg, who was doing a scientific expedition through the Polynesian area, but he called into Arica on the way because it was, due east of the thing. And this is where Elizabeth comes into play, is that I spent some time in the American Museum of Natural History working on collections that were taken from my site, which is about 9 kilometres south of Arica. In 1894, a fellow by the name of Adolfo Bandelier collected 4 mummies and 4 or 5 crates of goodies and sent them to the museum. And in amongst one of the wrapping, when they unwrapped one of the mummies, they found this Spanish document. And hopefully, with Elizabeth's help, we're going to translate it and actually work it out. Because when I say Spanish, it's not just Spanish language. It's a Spanish document. That has nothing to do with colonial South America that we can work out. And yet someone who was traditionally buried, a mummy, a flexed mummy wrapped in traditional materials, had a Spanish document dated to 1578. So this is 4 decades after the Spanish had arrived and taken Cusco and obviously impacted on this area. They were still burying their dead in a traditional manner, but had picked up this foreign exotic document. Oh, actually, I thought I did have another photograph that failed to pick. It was a brass thimble. So we've got a brass thimble and 2 glass beads also in this collection. So there's no sign of Spanish occupation in this valley. There's no haciendas. And you go to Arica, there's haciendas dating from the 16th century. But there's nothing here. But these people, the indigenous people in this valley, saw fit to bury their dead with these exotic goods that had been brought in by the Spanish. So that's just a brief taste of what the mortuary practices and the funeral practices in this area. And it's an out-of-the-way, remote location that most of you would have never heard about, and yet we've got evidence of it here in Sydney and the wider world. So I thank you for your interest. So. Only in the latter period. As I said, the Chinchorro mummies, it seems to be very egalitarian. Males, females, children, adults, family groups. As we go through and the political complexities increase, we certainly do, particularly hats. If you look at Paracas and Nazca going north, it's the volume, the amount of textiles that they're actually buried with. We don't have that down here. But what we call the chucus, these special hats that were... Today, if you go into the Andean region, the hats are indicators of region and status, and that's what we see with the burials. And obviously, riches, which we don't find very often. It's very rare, but they actually used animal skin, and there's a couple of mummies that just look like the Egyptian mummies. They've just got bandages, and we wondered whether they were falling to bits, like they'd started to decompose, and they were actually wrapping them up to hold them in place. We're not 100% sure, but... yeah, I mean, I tried to make it brief, but yes, they do have what we call the bandage-wrapped mummies, but not a lot. We think so because some show signs of damage and repair. So they might not have been brought out, they might have been kept in the house, or not the house, in where people lived. You know, the idea of death does not necessarily mean they stop being part of the family or the group. And, you know, this has occurred elsewhere, and certainly the Inca, they were taken out on little visits and used to meet regularly with their compatriots, even though they were dead. That's a good question, but it's almost global. There's very few cultures that haven't practiced some sort of artificial cranial deformation. A few Aboriginal groups in Australia actually practiced it, but they did it through actual manual manipulation. They just sort of massaged the heads on babies. It was like a status symbol. And if you go to some of the museums over there, you'll see a huge range of deformation. You know, the cone heads, really elongated, almost, well, actually there is a few people that claim that they're aliens. There's been a documentary I've seen twice in the last decade where this fellow's convinced that these are aliens because they have these long heads. But you'll find that are flattened here and pushed out, you know, all different shapes. We don't know, but it's to do with status, and they perhaps thought they were more attractive. Mainly because the neonates, they completely fall to bits. Very few of the bones are fused. Because my first introduction to a neonate was I found a vertebra, and I thought it was a bird bone. It looked like a wishbone, but it turned out it was half a vertebra because it hadn't fused, and that was a neonate, and that was laid on the chest of a woman. So perhaps they had died together. But probably the authority today on the Chinchorro mummies is a fellow by the name of Ben Arica, and he's actually written a paper where he suggests that the mummification practices started with children, and even like neonates and stillborn, as part of the grieving process. You know, it's one possibility that some of the oldest mummies we have are these almost fetuses. You know, they're only this big, tiny. And so, you know, that's one argument he's put up, that they started with children before they actually started doing everybody. Yeah. But I mean, we've compressed 4,000 years down into, you know, we really can't get that accurate a date, you know, but that's what we're looking at. But just to give you some idea, I mean, I came up with a figure one day of twice I've worked in Arica, in the city, and, you know, it's quite a modern city and so forth, but if they knock down one of the old buildings and start digging up in the backyard, they find remains. Now, the one that's the museum, there's about 50, at least 50 mummies in there, still there. And the one around the corner that I worked on was a swimming pool, and it wasn't a very, very big swimming pool, and we got 18. We had to get those out. They said, look, we're going to hold off the work, but there was nothing to protect. There was no legal protection on those mummies. The hotel wanted their swimming pool, but we'll hold off for a few weeks, so we really just had to go and get them out. Whereas the fellow who owned the building where the museum is, he was great. He said, look, I know these have cultural value, heritage value, and what they did is the university purchased a piece of land over here and swapped. So the university owned the mummies, and he got a bit of land and he built his building, and it was only 150 metres away. So, that worked very well. But we think, conservatively, there's 10,000 mummies under the city. And people have laughed when I've said that, quoted that figure, and I said, well, that's 5,000 years, that's a couple of thousand, there's not many a year. It's only a few a year. And as you say, you drop something in the ground, it's still going to be there. Piece of meat, piece of fish, it doesn't disappear. So that's why I like it. As an archaeologist, we find anything and everything, including things that you probably don't really want to find. Okay, thank you very much. I won't keep you from the refreshments.
Thank you.
Thank you.